Okay.
Fantastic.
And again, please mute yourself until we open it up for questions. And I'm going to hand it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle and Sherwood Regional Library for hosting us today. Greetings and welcome to everybody from the Mount Vernon and Alexandria branches, to all members and guests. And this is our first presentation of the 22-23 year. For those of you who are not members, I'm Diane Schreer. I'm co-president with Sylvia Linke of the Alexandria branch. And with me is Solveig Egers of the Mount Vernon branch, public policy chair. If you're not a member of AAUW, please sign on for the 2-minute activists, whether or not you're a member, actually. Last year, we sent 62,400 letters to our elected officers, notifying them of our feelings about different issues and the importance of action. This is one of our quickest ways of getting through to people, and it's a very important way. Also, our clubs are very active. We have dining clubs, we have book clubs, we have great decisions clubs, French club, game rooms, all sorts of activities. And AAUW is a very active and informed organization. We were founded in 1881. We have over 170,000 members and supporters. We've awarded over 135 grants and fellowships to more than 13,000 scholars and organizations, including the 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam, and over 150 countries. The issues we focus upon include education, workplace, economic equity, and leadership. We've worked very hard to decrease the STEM gap, supported Title IX issues, especially dealing with sexual harassment in schools and in workplaces, and provided research reports and data, and done a lot of work on their tremendous debt created for women by student loans. It's approximately $1.3 trillion of debt. And and 2/3 of that is owed by women. It's an unfair and horrendous burden. We've led that battle, and this battle continues. We've also trained women to support, negotiate pay and benefits, and for pursuing leadership roles. Because leadership, women have to take the lead now in many different things. If we don't take the lead, we'll never really be able to change the world and get rid of some of the problems like sexual harassment. Mount Vernon and Alexandria are 2 of the 11 branches in Northern Virginia, and we offer many opportunities for advocacy and fellowship. We meet for monthly programs, participate in state and national conferences, lobby days at the state and federal level, and we help register voters. And both groups are very, very busy and very active. We'll hope you all consider joining us. Solveig Egers will now introduce the discussion and our guests today.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for coming today, and a special thanks to our speakers. First of all, we have the pleasure of having Angie Maniglia Turner. She is the General Registrar and Director of Elections for the City of Alexandria. She was appointed to that position in July of 2020. She has served in the City of Alexandria's Office of Voter Registration and Elections since 2007 and has held the positions of Elections Manager, Deputy Registrar, and Assistant Elections Manager. Welcome, Angie. We're so pleased to have you. Jamshid Bakhtiari is the Director of Organizing and Community Engagement for the ACLU of Virginia. Prior to working with the ACLU of Virginia, Jamshid worked as a community organizer for the Virginia Poverty Law Center and the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. He was born and raised in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and has a master's degree in international law and human rights from the United Nations mandated University for Peace. Welcome, Jamshid. Deb Wake has been president of the League of Women Voters of Virginia since July 1, 2019. The League is a grassroots organization with no paid staff at the state level. Deb says that our volunteers come from 14 local leagues and members from across the state. And she says, we are proud of our work to strengthen democracy, empower voters through voter registration drives, candidate forums, educational studies and webinars, and advocacy. We were instrumental in passing redistricting reform in Virginia. Deb grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, went to college and started a family in the New River Valley, raised her family in a Richmond suburb, and has resided in Vienna, Virginia for the last 6 years. Welcome, Deb. And I'm also very pleased to tell you that on the Zoom call is also Nick Gotthard. Nick is the election protection manager with the nonpartisan organization VCET, which is Virginia Civic Engagement Table. Now, this is the place to go if you are one of those people who says, what can we do about it? Because VCET is recruiting poll monitors or election monitors, needs several dozen from the Northern Virginia area to protect the vote, to ensure that every Virginian can cast their ballot safely and securely across the Commonwealth. And these volunteers then report irregularities and make sure every voter is able to vote in 2022. Welcome, Nick. And Nick, would you please be so kind as to place your information in the chat, that is to say, the volunteer form and maybe your website so that people can look that up.
I will do that, yes.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Good to see you. So what we're going to do next is ask each of our speakers to give us some introductory remarks for just a few minutes. Tell us what kind of work you're doing in this field of elections and voting, and also, and very importantly, tell us what your concerns are about these topics, because your concerns will be our concerns, and we're looking for answers. So let's start with Angie. Angie, would you just tell us a few things that are top of mind for you?
Sure. So as you said, my name is Angie. I am the General Registrar and Director of Elections for the City of Alexandria. So some kind of background on our office. Our office's primary responsibility is to conduct federal, state, and local elections in accordance with federal, state, and local laws. When it comes to our office, we do all of our administration through kind of our 4 standards. Our 4 standards include accuracy. Obviously, the most important thing about elections is getting it correct and accurate, whether it's according to the law, whether it's accurate to the election results. Transparency, our office is as transparent as we legally can be when it comes to everything. The most important thing is that the secrecy of the ballot. Obviously, we do everything to protect the ballot secrecy. Neutrality, our office is nonpartisan. So that is very important when it comes to administering elections, that nonpartisan. And integrity, obviously, we have to uphold that standard in everything that we do. So when it comes to our office's kind of responsibilities include voter registration. So we maintain an accurate list of qualified individuals to vote in the city of Alexandria. Currently, we have about 100,000 active registered voters. We manage the precincts and polling places in the city. We currently have 30 voting locations. Voting equipment and ballots, that's another one of our office's responsibilities. Election officer recruitment and training. I heard some recruitment over there. I also like to recruit people for serving as an election officer in the polling place on election day. We are constantly searching for individuals who are interested in serving. It is a long day, but it is a very rewarding day. Absentee voting. Our office also handles absentee voting, both in person and by mail, and also the local candidate filing paperwork and petitions and all of that. That's kind of just a little background on our office. And excuse me, this year we'll actually be implementing the new laws changes to Virginia. So that includes same-day registration, the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, and the absentee reporting by precinct. So those are the three big laws changes that are coming and that we are in the process of implementing.
Mhm. Any concerns you want to mention that you have about voter suppression or election subversion? Any worries? Or would you prefer to keep that to yourself?
In my role as registrar, I do feel it's very important to be nonpartisan and kind of more serve as like the reference point for things. So I'm happy to answer questions, talk about policies, procedures, things like that.
So I do have one question before we move on, because you mentioned voter registration. You can find out if a voter is registered through your office. Because I was looking, let's say I'm an ex-offender and I want to see if my voting rights have been restored. And I ended up going to the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Virginia website, K. Coles James, where you learn the status. But can I just as soon go to you in the city of Alexandria and ask, am I eligible to vote as an ex-offender?
Sure. So if we do have someone who calls our office and asks if their rights have been restored, we go to that same website and it's the same information we're pulling. And if they are have their rights restored, we'll get them through the process to get them registered to vote. And if their rights have not been restored, we'll kind of direct them through the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office to get that process started.
Okay, that's really good information to know that they don't have to go to Richmond for that. Okay, thank you, Angie. So let's move on. Jamshid, would you like to tell us what kind of work you're doing and what you are worried about?
Sure, of course. And just to start off with a word of appreciation, I want to give a big thank you to you, Solveig, for putting this whole thing together, for the association, for everyone involved, and everyone that came out to spend an hour and a half on a Saturday to attend this event to help defend and protect democracy. It's going to take a lot of actions like this if we want to maintain a healthy democracy in this country. So I thank you for that. In terms of concerns that the ACLU of Virginia has, there are many. Right. So, and this goes all the way from local troublemakers that might try to subvert the election system because they're believers in the big lie, to state elected officials, to national players, to Supreme Court cases that we're going to be seeing coming up. All those things are scary to us, and we're really glad that the Virginia Civic Engagement Table and folks like Nick are in place to have poll monitors to help at the grassroots level monitor that type of stuff. So if you're interested in looking out for those types of threats, please click that link that Nick shared in the chat and volunteer to be an election monitor. In terms of what the ACLU of Virginia has put most of its energy into on the voting rights issue, it is in regards to voter disenfranchisement, and in particular, voter disenfranchisement for folks in the criminal legal system. So we are part of a coalition of different organizations, including the Legal Women Voters, No Left Turns, Bridging the Gap, the Virginia Interfaith Center, the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. And we've been in a coalition for a number of years to push for a constitutional amendment ensuring the right to vote for everyone in Virginia's Constitution. We got pretty close to meeting that threshold this past year, but no dice. We didn't meet that threshold. It's a pretty onerous process to get a constitutional amendment passed in Virginia. Quick, refresher for folks that might not remember the Virginia Constitution course, whatever it is. But you have to get a resolution passed in the House and Senate by a majority vote in 2 separate General Assembly sessions with an intervening election before it goes to the ballot, and then the voters decide on it. So at the shortest amount of time that could take 3 years, could take 4 years if you have to wait for that intervening election. So it's a very long and onerous process we have here in Virginia to get that constitutional amendment passed. So we believe that the constitutional amendment should be passed for a number of reasons. The first is that Virginians, we believe in second chances. We believe just because you've done something wrong doesn't mean you should be cut off from a fundamental pillar of democratic participation. You should still have a voice in democracy, regardless if you've done something wrong. The second is that all the research shows that engaged citizens are going to be more productive citizens, and felons that have gotten the right to vote restored to them are less likely to recidivate. They feel like They are cared for by society and they have a voice in society, and therefore are less likely to fall into the same patterns that might have led them to that mistake that they made in the past. Is someone about to chime in? I think someone just called in, so I'm going to continue. And the third, and this is quite significant for us at the ACLU of Virginia, we believe that the criminal legal system as it exists today is an extension of a Jim Crow racial caste system that has disproportionately targeted communities of color, in particular Black communities and Latino communities, and has really diminished their power in terms of participating in democracy. So we are going to continue to push for that constitutional amendment, and we're really lucky to have such great partners like Deb Wake with the League of Women Voters, Sheba Williams from No Left Turns, Richard Walker from Bridging the Gap, and many others along this process.
Thank you very much, Jamshid. And let's move on to Deb. What, I know you're always up to lots and lots of things, and you have lots and lots of concerns.
I do. Well, actually, my biggest concern is people not voting. So even if people have had their rights restored, making sure that they then exercise those rights. And in Virginia, you have an opportunity to vote at least once a year. Where I live in Fairfax, my delegate has already resigned, so I know that I'm going to have a second election January 10th. And so it's important to participate in all of those. Some people wait for a presidential election and think that that's the big deal, but it's really the local elections, your school boards, your board of supervisors, and your delegates. Virginia, I'm president of the state league, so we operate at the state level, but I'm also a member of my local league. And just making sure that you participate locally as well as at the state level. One misconception, and probably it's better to leave this to Angie, but a lot of people think that if they have to cast a provisional ballot, that only counts if the race is close. And just to let people know that the provisional ballots are looked at by the election board the day after the election. And so all of those are considered. And one of the most important laws that passed, Angie came on at a great time when we got a huge onslaught of changes in election laws. And we're very pleased at the improved voter access that came with those. But one of the most important ones that we got was the curing process was implemented. So what happened in the past before the new law in 2020 was that if you made a mistake on your absentee ballot envelope, then your vote didn't count. And now there's a process in place so that if there is something wrong, the registrars can contact those voters, correct that information so that the ballot does count. And I think that that's a huge improvement in our democracy. You talked about, and I guess the other thing that I think is really important is the no excuse 45 days of early voting. And it used to be that you needed a reason that you were voting early, and now you don't. It's important that everybody gets out and vote. It's important to vote early because things come up on election day, and don't leave it to the last minute. So get out there and vote early. There are so many different ways that you can vote. You can vote absentee by mail. And I do want to remind everyone that you do need to have a witness for your absentee ballot now. We had litigated during the pandemic to waive that requirement, but we haven't been able to change that in the law yet. So that is the law again. And so make sure that if you do cast an absentee ballot, that you do have a witness. But that is something that the registrars would catch during the curing process and make sure that gets taken care of. You brought up voter fraud, and our biggest concern about the fraud narrative is that it's a lie, that there really is not a lot of fraud. And the problem is that it creates a distrust in the system, in the process, and there's no proof of it. And the people who are screaming about fraud are foiling the pants off of our election officials and really tying up all of the work that they have to do with all of the improved access and things like that they're sending so many FOIA requests. They're just burying our election officials with these FOIA requests. And then they never come back out and go, you know what, we were looking for fraud and we didn't find it. They never tell you that. And that's a frustration for me. And I am an election officer, and I would like to say that when you come into the precinct where I'm working, you do not know what party the election officers are with. We are all there for the purpose of making sure that the election runs smoothly and that voters get to vote. And I think that that's the important message. So sorry, I got a little carried away there, but I am kind of passionate about the opportunity to vote.
Thank you, Deb. That's all very important information. And I'm just wondering, you said a number of things that have both good and not, like the no excuse thing is gone and things like.
No, you still have, no excuse absentee voting is that you do not need an excuse to
You
vote
don't need-
absentee.
Yeah, right. You don't
Right.
need an excuse, and that's a good thing.
That's a good
But you
thing.
still need a witness. So
You do need a
details
witness.
like that, are they available easily on your website for voters to check, am I okay with my voting?
We do have a frequently asked questions, and I can drop that link into the chat.
That would
But
be good.
But the requirement is on the envelope. And so just as you're working through the absentee ballot envelope, just read it carefully. And if you have any questions, then call your registrar.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Yeah, and speaking of registrar, Angie, could you maybe drop something into the chat also? If you have frequently asked questions or any informational thing so that people can know that they can go to you to learn certain things?
Absolutely. I'll drop our website. It has a lot of great information, sample ballots for the upcoming election, and things like that. We are in the process of reviving it, so hopefully it'll look a little nicer in the coming weeks, but it definitely is a great source of information.
Yeah, just so it's easy to read. That's all we care about. Nick, are you there? Nick Gottard?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, so I just wondered if you could also say a few words about why you feel it is so important to get these monitors to the polls. Now, you're not calling these they're not poll workers, they're not poll volunteers, they're called poll monitors, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so maybe you could just tell us what you're kind of up against and why you are advocating for, what is it, several dozen
Mhm.
poll
Yes.
workers, poll monitors?
So the Virginia Civic Engagement Table, or VCET, works within the Election Protection Coalition here in Virginia, and is a part of a larger national election protection coalition that spans the entire country. We are very passionate about making sure that every voter is able to vote their ballot in a safe and secure way. And so what we do during early voting and on election day is deploy our election or poll monitors across polling sites, including in the Northern Virginia region where you are all located, in order to make sure that if voters are experiencing any difficulties with being able to vote, if a polling place is dealing with malfunctioning equipment, long lines, anything like that, it can be escalated to our state command center. And then we really want to make sure that we have folks on the ground to be able to answer questions or help folks navigate the voting process. So if they have questions about voter ID, if they're having difficulties with access to a provisional ballot, we give all our volunteers the top issue sheets and directions to navigate these commonly interacted with issues to make sure that all voters are able to vote when they go to the voting location. So yes, in Northern Virginia, it is several dozen. Across the Commonwealth, it's a couple hundred election monitors, and we have a long history of executing this program in Virginia, and we're looking forward to a very successful year this year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So there wouldn't be a problem with did you have to have permission to go in as a poll monitor?
So our election monitors are located outside of the polling locations, outside of the electioneering line. Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yes. Okay, good. That's good. Clarify that. Okay. So now everybody, you know where to go if you want to really help out and and respond to the need. So you can do that in addition to voting. So I'm going to turn it over to Diane, who wants to ask a question or two.
There, sorry, I was muted. In the last 4 years, there have been a lot of changes occurring in Virginia voting and election laws. This is a nonpartisan question, but with the change of administrations, there have been different emphasis made. Could you talk about it and also talk about gerrymandering in Virginia? There are 11 congressional districts. And how has the impact of gerrymandering affected Virginia voting? Like I know in Florida, there's some districts that have the center of one block connecting districts that are miles away from each other. Does anyone want to take that? Who would like to take that?
I do.
Okay.
So the League of Women Voters has recognized what a problem gerrymandering is across the United States. And the National League had a 50-state plus initiative to address it. And Virginia was actually one of the few states that was successful in addressing gerrymandering. We basically redrew the maps. So you kind of had to start from scratch because it was 400 years of gerrymandering. The process was messy. We had a redistricting commission that devolved into partisan lines, but the backstop was the Supreme Court of Virginia. And they were required by law to appoint 2 special masters. And we're very happy with the maps that they produced. And those maps are being used for the congressional races this year. And so please do check to make sure that even though you didn't move, your lines may have moved, and that the congressperson that you're used to voting for may not still be your congressperson. So make sure that you know who you're voting for. But we're excited to see these play out next year in the elections for the House of Delegates. We think that it gives a better opportunity for representation because there's more opportunity for new candidates. There are some areas that are new districts, and so there's no incumbent candidate. And we think that there's better opportunity for minority candidates to be successful. So we're very pleased about the process of redistricting in Virginia. And the other thing that the special masters did was nest the districts so that they tried to make the House districts inside of the Senate districts, inside of the congressional districts, so that it wasn't such a Venn diagram of overlap, just weirdnesses about who your representatives were and how that looked to your neighbors' representatives.
Anybody else want to address Diane's questions?
Diane, can you repeat that? I believe it was like a 2-part question. Just want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly.
I talked about that there have been a lot of changes in the last 4 years due to different administrations, and this is a nonpartisan question. What changes have occurred in Virginia voting and election laws? And we need that everybody needs to be aware of it. And thank you, Deb, for addressing the gerrymandering question, because that is a major issue. But there have been a lot of changes also. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of those, or somebody could talk about this.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. And I'm not going to be able to recite the full totality of laws that were passed the past couple of years that expanded access to the ballot box, but it has been quite significant. A big impetus for this was the COVID-19 pandemic that allowed access to early voting at greater stages. And of course, because these things were passed through the legislature can just as easily take them back if they wanted to do so, right? So we at the ACLU of Virginia are advocating that all the laws that were passed that make access to the ballot box easier for folks stay in place. If any threats to those come up in the legislature, we'll be there to advocate against the passage of those laws, and we'll continue to protect the laws that have been passed and advocate for increased access to the ballot box across the board in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Anyone else want to talk about it at all? Or anyone else have any questions about it?
I think another important law that passed was the expansion of what's accepted as an ID. So that it's much easier to vote. And there will be continue to be attacks on voter ID laws that people think they're not stringent enough. As long as the legislature remains split between the parties, there's probably not going to be a lot of change this next session, but it doesn't mean that people won't attempt to make those changes. So you'll continue to see those bad laws introduced and hopefully fail.
Right, the law that was just in the Washington Post last week, the voter integrity election unit, you mentioned that briefly, but I mean, we've seen that in a few other states. In fact, in Florida, again, they've hired a special police force to arrest people who thought they were allowed to vote. And turned out they weren't, and now are in jail.
Or
And-
back in jail. That were free.
Yeah.
Those were frequently ex-offenders.
All
Yeah.
of those have a chilling effect on elections, whether or not you would be affected by it. You don't, there's a lot of uncertainty and people don't want to be inadvertently swept up in it. And so that I don't like it because it also brings into question, I mean, it's the fact voting is the fabric of democracy, to grab Jam's word there. And whenever you're calling into question, is voting reliable? Are people who shouldn't be voting and things like that, then it just calls the whole process into question and the results into question. And it's not that we're not saying if there's a fraud, you shouldn't address it. We're saying that there are lots of things in place that mitigate those opportunities to commit fraud. And we think that our elections are very secure and the results are reliable.
Mhm. Deb, I just wanted to ask you about that. When you mentioned the voting ID, those laws have been made more stringent in other states, I think, with very severe demand for photo ID that people often don't have access to. But I thought that in Virginia, there was a pretty liberal approach to this. You could bring in your utility bill, your lease from your rental apartment, various things like that had your name on it, no photo ID. It's been that way for several years. Am I not right on that? Or is that a change?
That's a recent change. That was in 2020. I think before it was maybe 2008, the voter ID law was put into place when McDonnell was governor. And so that has been a change to open that up. Now, we did see laws introduced last year, and I actually threw out my testimony in the session because what we were seeing was a cornucopia of speakers coming up and saying, I'm an immigrant, I'm a person of color, I don't have a problem getting an ID. I think it's silly to expect that people don't have the wherewithal to get IDs. And the message that I shared was the people who have problems getting IDs are not in this room. They don't have the resources to take off work or what have you to come here and testify. So you're not hearing from the people that are affected by those sort of laws. And so anything that we can do to make it easier for people who don't have the privilege of having easy access to IDs, anything we can do to make it easier for them to also be represented in our democracy is a good thing.
Yes, good. I just thought that had been in effect previously. I see a hand up, so I'm going to call on Susan Burke rather than moving on with my own questions.
Oh, thank you. I
You have
don't
your
really,
hand
yeah, I don't have a question per se, but I just wanted to follow up that in AUW, we were following the legislation this previous year, and we did see a proliferation of bills that were introduced but not passed, all aimed at rolling back voting access. And I think what we had been becoming gently used to was having greater access to the ballot, more convenient, early voting, no excuse voting, and that sort of thing, which made it very convenient for folks. But there was a big effort to roll that back so that you couldn't have no excuse voting, you couldn't do early voting, no drop boxes and so forth. And so it is really going to be important to stay on top of what's being proposed in Richmond and let legislators know what you think about that, because I think they had, and Deb would know this better than anybody, my understanding was they had, one of the highest turnouts in Virginia that they've ever had. And in fact, there was no fraud. So I think this voter integrity unit smacks to me more of trying to suggest that there's fraud when there really isn't. Taxpayers need to wonder if that's money well spent to hire all these lawyers. But it's an active issue, and I do think we will see efforts again to make it more difficult to exercise your vote, and it should be the opposite. So that's just a comment, having followed this very closely over the last 4 years for AAUW Virginia, and particularly this past year with all the bills that came forward.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to address that? Making it more difficult to vote, the voter suppression, those issues?
Well, I'll just add on to what Susan's saying. And I think what she just said to me demonstrates something very powerful. And Susan, you're talking about how you've been able to follow these things through the AAUW. The most important things folks can do at this point to keep an eye out for this type of legislation that attacks the fundamental pillars of our democracy is to create a relationship with an organization that is actively following and lobbying these issues. So whether it be the AAUW, the League of Women Voters, the Aclu of Virginia, or any number of other organizations, I think the fact that you're already on the Zoom call is saying you're already doing that. So that's great. So continue to show up to events like this, continue to read the emails, and especially around the General Assembly session. I know it's winter. I know people are depressed because there's no sun. I know it's flu season, but please keep your eye out on the emails, because that's when the biggest threats are going to come. They're going to come in January and February. So keep an eye out for the emails from the AAUW, from the League of Women Voters, from the ACLU, and other organizations around that time.
And I wanted to add one more thing. Even if you support what your legislator is doing, they do keep track, and that does help them when they're speaking to their colleagues and they say, I am hearing from my constituents that they support this. That is powerful, even though you might think you don't need to say anything because you're in agreement.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, if there are no other questions, I want to ask my big one. And that comes under national trends. And this is something that has just scared me to death recently. And I've seen that a lot of good people have been writing about this, including the Brennan Center for Justice and so forth. And it's about the proposed independent legislature theory. And I also just want to make people aware that this is coming up, this court case coming before the Supreme Court. Moore versus Halper. It's a North Carolina redistricting case, and there was the court in North Carolina challenged a heavily gerrymandered district there and said this is not constitutional, and the lawyers then went up the chain and are bringing this to the Supreme Court and saying this is fine and it matches up with the independent legislature theory, which says that, or emphasizes that the court shall have no role. Everything all election administration shall be conducted by the state legislature. And this is a cause for worry for people like me who worry a lot, because the court is the one that enforces the state constitution. And so if it's all just with the legislature, it has the propensity to become extreme, that all decisions can become extremely partisan. So does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Or do you think this is something that'll just go away? Big thoughts like, how would this perhaps impact Virginia? Is there a chance we might go in this direction?
Sylvia, I'll start by saying I echo and share all the concerns you have. It's an incredibly alarming case, the implications of which, like you said, could subvert democracy to levels hitherto unseen in the United States. And what is particularly frightening about it is this independent state legislature theory was the cornerstone of Trump's big lie strategy. He wanted to give the power back to the state legislatures to send electors that were saying that he won the election after all. So it's really scary. We don't know exactly how this is going to play on the Supreme Court. We do have some folks at ACLU National that are researching this, looking into it a little while further, but we don't really know what the implications are going to be until we see the outcome of that Supreme Court case. And even after the outcome of that Supreme Court case, there are going to be questions. So it's definitely something that is cause for worry. It's something that we need to keep our eyes on. And another reason to double down on all of the work that's being done, for example, by the Virginia Civic Engagement Table, to be a watcher at the polls, right? To keep an eye out if anything does, any funny business does happen at the polls. At least we're going to have people there to keep an eye on it, to document it.
Thank you, Jamshid, for confirming that this is something to worry about. So, Diane, do you want to pick up some
So
questions?
following up on his answer, I wanted to know if it goes back to the states, if we have a very conservative Supreme Court at this point, and it's hard to say which way they could go. They could go based on precedent, which they've overthrown. John Marshall tried hundreds of years ago to make sure the Supreme Court had central authority in a lot of things. They could go that direction. They could also go the opposite direction of throwing all precedent out and just handing it back to the states. And this is a guess. What does anyone feel might happen? And you might not, and I'm not asking for a definite answer. You can't give me a definite answer. But we know it would create absolute chaos and in a sense, destroy judicial authority in terms of elections if it does happen, if this theory does get accepted. Could you elaborate on any of that at all, please?
Yeah, those are really great questions, Diane. Unfortunately, I can't have an answer for that. I don't know how the Supreme Court is going to play out. Like you said, we do have a very conservative Supreme Court, the most conservative Supreme Court of my lifetime, and perhaps many of the lifetimes of folks on this call. So it's a reason for concern. It's something to keep our eyes on, but at this time, I can't make a comment on which way it might go.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Are there any questions from the audience at this point?
I had a question in the chat. Should I just voice it now?
Yeah, just go ahead and voice it, Joanne.
Okay, the no excuses rule in another state was just deemed unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. And I'm wondering if it happens in one state, might that give ideas to people in another state like Virginia to mount a challenge? I'm wondering if any challenges have indeed been mounted, because if it's unconstitutional in one state, although I know state constitutions differ, I'm just wondering what's in our constitution.
Deb.
So that's one thing that would help if we were to get our constitutionally protected right to vote. That would certainly help address that. But we do have the laws to support same-day voter registration, but the no excuse 45 days of no excuse absentee voting, that is in our laws. It did pass our legislature, so that is law. It could be challenged in court, but you can't use the court to change the law. That has to be the legislature. And so that's that separation of powers thing. Certainly they could change the law, but, and it is something to watch for. For instance, there's something called the Zuckerbox Bill, and I don't know if you've heard about that. In Virginia, SB 80 and the companion bill HB 205 passed, and that limits where election funding can come from. It has to come from a government resource, or Angie probably knows better all of the places that can come from. But it put the league, and it could put AAUW in a touchy spot where it talks about services. And the Attorney General's office has not given guidelines to the Department of Elections. And so it has been up to the individual county or
Frozen.
Okay, yes, yes.
registrar cannot have,
Okay, she's on. Yeah, she's okay.
that registrars cannot have, sorry, my internet connection is unstable.
We can hear you now, Deb. You
can, okay,
faded
good.
out for a while. You're loud and
Okay.
clear now.
You're
Okay,
fine.
sorry. But basically that called into question whether or not third-party registration can happen. And we contend that we are doing that as a service to voters, not as an arm of the registrars. And so that's the part that we're complaining about. But it has put registrars in a tough bind, trying to interpret that. I know that here in Fairfax, a vendor would deliver pizza on, vendor meaning a pizza place would deliver pizza on election day. And now they cannot accept that because, anything that could be perceived as influencing the elections. And it's kind of gotten crazy that somebody can't do something nice for the registrars or the election office, given the long hours and how important the job is.
Mhm.
Oh, but my point was, we're seeing that law pass in multiple states. So that's why I brought that up.
Ah, good, good. So it's going in the other way, the positive and not the negative direction.
No, that's a negative.
But, okay, no, I thought you said that we didn't have to have an excuse, and that is now.
We
what's-
don't have to have an excuse, and that is true, but I'm saying this Zuckerbox Bill is something that we are seeing across the nation. So a lot of these are being proposed by the Heritage Foundation.
Oh, sorry.
They're providing templates to lawmakers across the United States, and we're seeing those introduced into state legislatures.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the wording of the no excuse. Yeah, thank you. Claire, you have a question. Do you want to speak it out?
Yes, I've always wondered, how do I have a right to a secret ballot? I always assumed I did, but I can't find anything on it. I had a problem when I was trying to get my signature witness. The person who was supposed to be helping me picked up my ballot and read it, which annoyed me. He was just supposed to witness the signature. And I thought, well, how do I have a right to a secret ballot? Is it in the Constitution? I couldn't find it. Good question. No one knows either.
Maybe Angie would know that. Angie, are you still here?
I would have to check that if it's in Constitution or law. I'm not familiar with the section right off the top of my head. Obviously, our office does everything possible to protect that secrecy, but the exact where it is from would start.
I just
to look into
assumed
it
I
right
had
now.
it, but I can't prove it.
So Claire, that's a really great question. I'm going to be putting my email address in the chat box. Please shoot me an email and I'll ask this question to one of our attorneys that specializes in the matter, and hopefully they can give some clarity on that for you.
Thank you.
And that was one of the things that we argued about in our lawsuit to remove that witness requirement, was because it does compromise the ability to have a secret ballot.
Ah,
Yeah. Let's see here. So are there any other questions from participants? Just raise your hand, even like this. Jamshid, I was fascinated by what you said about the connection between the Jim Crow laws and some of the restrictions that we're seeing today. Would you be willing to expand a little bit on that?
Sure.
I'd
And
love to hear more about that.
And I'll try to break this down as best I can to my ability. For folks that are interested in doing some reading, there's a really incredible book written by Michelle Alexander, who used to work for the ACLU of Northern California, I believe, called The New Jim Crow.
Right.
I believe it was published about 10 years ago. So this is a pre-Trump book. So you have to keep that in mind when this was written. But it really did bring to national attention the grave injustice that is being done in our criminal legal system that disproportionately affects communities of color, in particular Black communities and Latino communities. Now, we already know, and I think it's pretty much accepted at this point as a society, that we incarcerate more folks per capita than any country in the world, more than authoritarian regimes like Russia, more than China, more than Iran. We incarcerate more folks per capita than any country on the planet. And we disproportionately, to a striking degree, disproportionately incarcerate communities of color, in particular men of color, in particular Black men and Latino men. Now, what Michelle Alexander breaks down in this book is how in the 1970s, a lot of the top leading criminologists were almost in consensus about the idea that prisons would be obsolete, because the research at that point had shown that prisons did nothing to stop crime. So if the purpose of a criminal legal system in prisons is to reduce crime, prisons are not stopping crime. In fact, the research was showing that they're actually leading to an increase in crime. But what we see is the exact opposite. In the 1970s, we see a ramping up of incarceration to a really striking degree. And I don't know the exact statistic, maybe ramping up fivefold, sixfold of incarceration rates. And what Michelle Alexander does a really beautiful job backing up with research, with statistics, and with the firsthand accounts of the architects of the criminal legal system, as you know it today, is how this has been used as an extension to disenfranchise low-income communities of color. And she talks about how having a felony on your record bars you from a whole host of social supports and access to participation in society that were formerly withheld from communities of color during the Jim Crow era. So that'd be things like access to housing, access to education grants, and access to the right to vote, right? So that's what I was meaning with that, Solveig. I'm hoping that I'm articulating an answer to your question. I think if you want to read the most thorough and articulate breakdown of this, which I think Michelle Alexander does a masterful job of doing, check out The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And I'll put a link to the book in the chat if folks are interested.
Good, thank you. That's very interesting. We too soon forget the enormous restrictions under Jim Crow. And I mean, it seems also that there's nothing new under the sun, in the sense that if you have a history, or you've got it documented, the things that were done under Jim Crow to prevent voting, to restrict voting, it doesn't take much imagination to see that. You just look up and get some ideas from the past. There's so many ways that you can intimidate people, or just make it harder. I mean, I've been reading books about the history of Mississippi, and oh my gosh, one of the civil rights workers like Ann Moody describes it from an African-American's point of view, the enormous restrictions and how terribly difficult it was to get people to register to vote. And I feel like we may be in danger of not a borderline moving towards that, this fear.
Yeah.
I don't think it's borderline. I think we're moving there, and I think it's not a coincidence that the same things are being done now that were done during Jim Crow, and it's all part of the autocrat's book to control everything and to control the people. So this is just the plan in my mind. This is their plan.
Joanne, that's a really good point. And to build off a little bit of what Solveig was saying, is that you're talking about the struggles they had to register voters in Mississippi. What makes the mass incarceration system so particularly insidious is that you're legally prohibit it from registering felons if their right has been taken away. So there's not even that opportunity to register them at that point. So I think what this tells us is that as we look to solutions for the felony disenfranchisement problem, we need to be very vigilant about what form racial caste might take in the future after mass incarceration. So I think, and that's to Joanne's point as well, is if there's a plan in place to stop this, I mean, this country is very nimble in terms of its way of adjusting to changing times. So we need to be very vigilant of that coming up.
Well, part of the problem is that private prisons need 92% occupancy to give money back to wherever they're located. They don't have that much occupancy. So it makes it a financial desire on certain types of communities to arrest people. I mean, that's part of the built-in plan.
And Diane, we corrected prison gerrymandering at the same time that we fixed gerrymandering across the state. And what that is we were counting prisoners in the place where they're incarcerated rather than their last known location. And most people, I think the average sentence is 3 years. And when you consider districts are drawn every 10 years, not to say that everybody ends up back where they started, but most do. And so making sure that when they're counted for census purposes, it's where they live and not where they're incarcerated.
Well, I was surprised, Jamshid, when you mentioned the difficulties you've had regarding the restoration of rights to offenders, ex-offenders, because it is stated somewhere that prisoners, ex-offenders have automatically received their civil rights back upon completion of their time in prison.
So that's a great question.
It's not quite automatic, though.
Yeah, and I see Deb shaking her head. Deb, you want to take this one on?
Sure. In Virginia, your rights are restored at the governor's discretion. It has nothing to do with you're having served your time. There are other components like, do you have housing and things like that. And so that was part of the amendment that we were working so hard to pass, was it did include an auto restoration, because we don't think that the governor should have the sole authority over whether someone has served their time and gets their rights back. I think we're one of 3 states. It could be 2. When I was trying to find the 3rd state, I couldn't find them.
Where it's not automatic, are you
Yes.
saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but it's automatic in Florida probably, but there are tremendous financial obstacles for that, for offenders too.
Well, that was established by the legislature, who decided to go against the people's referendum that would have automatically given the rights back to the felons. It was voted overwhelmingly in favor of that, and then the Republican legislature undid it and added this requirement about the fines.
Yeah, they didn't undo, they can't undo the amendment, but they did add the requirement.
Yeah.
Problem was that when people applied to pay the fines, and many donors came in from other areas to say we would pay the fines for people, they didn't know where to find the fines. There was no directory to find the fines. People didn't know how to get the fines. And
Right.
basically it stopped right there. A few people were able to vote again. Many were just stopped.
Just awful.
Actually, and when Scott was governor, what he did there was to cut down the number of parole board presentations. There had been several under Christ, and then Scott narrowed it down to only a few. I think it became like 3 a year, but don't quote me on that number, but it was far less than there had previously been. And they only took a few people, which meant, and the funding was cut dramatically, which meant most people could not get their voting rights back after parole. It was like you had to wait for parole to finish, and then wait another 5 years after that before you could apply to get your rights restored.
Yeah.
And then you had to wait till the board would call your name. And since the board was only meeting 3 times a year, and only a few people would get through each time, because you could be rejected, you could wait 20 years to get your rights restored in Florida. If you were lucky.
Diane, and thank you for breaking that down. I think that all really demonstrates what this is all about is disenfranchising large groups of voters. It has nothing to do with justice. It has nothing to do with right and wrong. They just don't want people to vote.
Right, exactly.
It's all about the numbers. It's probably closely related to the voter roll purges. It's just a matter of, how many 100,000 people can you not have voting?
Does anyone think that there have been some quiet voting roll purges already here in Virginia? I mean, it's very possible to do it. Maybe, Angela, have you heard anything about this?
So for our office, you mean every time our office does any of the inactivation of registered voters or purging, it's done through the state. And the state publishes all that information on their website. Obviously we want to keep individuals registered to vote at their current address and get them to the correct place so that on election day there isn't an issue. So we do everything possible, sending out where do you live letters to try and get them to make sure that their registration is up to date. Virginia does, do list maintenance, but there's actually a very, to me, interesting information on the state's website that kind of talks about that list maintenance, and I'm happy to drop that into the chat. That kind of goes into that information.
Yeah, go ahead, do that.
One of the fraud narratives is dead people voting. And so there was a law that passed last year that causes the Department of Elections to get the information from the Department of Health on a weekly basis now, instead of, I think it was monthly before.
I think it's very helpful. What you're saying here, Deb, is when you're pointing to these like a fraud narrative, under frequently asked questions, that's a really important thing, because this has to do with correcting misinformation. And if it's said often enough, then people start to believe it. But if, for example, the league were to correct that on its website and said, this is not true, this is fraud, this is dead people voting is fraud narrative. That would be very, very helpful, because we're all susceptible to that. It sinks in finally. Oh yeah, maybe dead people are voting, especially at Halloween, they're all out voting.
So the Virginia Department of Elections actually just published, sorry to interrupt, a Mythbusters site to try and combat some of that malinformation. So I just dropped that in the chat, and it is kind of exactly what you're talking about, those FAQs of busting some of those myths.
Great, that's great. What a great Halloween costume, dead person voting. Sylvia, did you have a question?
Yes, when I worked at the polls passing out information about, candidates, I noticed that there was a certain number of people who would come to the poll, a certain place to vote, and yet they went to the wrong place, or they hadn't registered properly. People did not seem to know the procedure for how to exercise their right to vote, what they needed to do. I was wondering if anyone is doing anything to educate voters, and this seemed to be largely voters of color, minority groups who just, I saw poll workers take someone in their car to the correct poll so they could vote, trying to help these people out who were coming in on the last minute and didn't know how the proper procedures to follow. So is anyone educating people to help going out in the community to help them to know what to do?
I would love to jump in and talk just a little bit about two aspects of our election protection program that we run. So in addition to the field, which I'll get to in a second, we do run a voter education program. A large part of that right now is targeted towards voting locations that might have changed or moved, and making sure that we are letting voters in those localities know via direct mail, via text messages, different ways to reach them that, City Hall moved across the street and that's where your early voting location is now. And the same thing for election day locations. And so, we are tracking as many of those instances as possible to make sure that voters are aware of when these changes happen. In addition to advertising the voter assistance hotline as much as possible, so that if voters encounter these issues when they do go and vote, that they have the ability to find their correct location. And then on the field aspect, making sure that we have our poll monitors in place so that if a voter is turned away because they're not at the right location, if they're having difficulty finding the right location, anything like that, that we do have trusted individuals who are nonpartisan with the goal of assisting voters there to look up their registration, let them know the correct location to vote, give them directions if they need directions to the right location, anything like that, to be able to provide that, at the point of incident sort of guidance. And so that's one of the things that I think is best about our program, is that making sure that, regardless of what might be happening across the Commonwealth, that we are making sure that there are people there to help. Because as much as you can look forward and predict what might happen, you've got no idea, the kind of issues that are going to pop up on election day. And so we're really passionate about building the framework to be able to help folks as soon as possible when incidents do occur.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Nick. BCET is the group to lean on and bring your troubles to. So are there any other concerns, questions? If they're not, we'll just go and start doing our voting calisthenics and get all revved up for the election. So I'd like to ask our speakers to, if you have any final thoughts, if you want to summarize something or something that came up that not in direct response to any of the questions, but any further thoughts you might like to give us at closing?
I'll take a stab at that too. And again, if this is going to be the closing, I do want to
Well,
reassert.
actually, I'm sorry. I think I read the time wrong. It's really only 12:09. I thought it was 12:19. But go ahead, Jamshid. You've started talking, so go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Solveig. I just want to reassert my thank you to you and all the other organizers for this great event, for the other panelists, and for all the participants. I just want to reassert the most important thing that you can do to keep an eye on the threats to your democracy is to continue building a relationship with a group that's working on this issue. Because when we take action collectively, we're going to be much more powerful. We're going to be much more coordinated. We can bring our resources together. So continue to show up to events that the AAUW puts on, that the ACLU of Virginia puts on, that the League of Women Voters puts on, or any other group that you closely identify with, and keep reading their emails. That's number one. If you want to take that next step, please click on the link to be a poll monitor with VSET. And I'm going to put that in the link one more time. I know we've been chatting in there quite a bit. Oh, chat's been disabled. So do you mind, Ria?
No, the chat is, wait a minute.
It shouldn't be disabled.
It's not disabled. It's right here.
You want to
Okay.
try one more time?
Yeah,
Yeah, it says-
volunteer with us, and here's Nick, and his email is here. The organization is there. But if
Okay.
you just Google VCET, that is the organization also.
Great. And for some reason it's saying chat disabled. So Solveig, I'm gonna email the link if you can put that in the chat box too. I just emailed it to you now. I wanted to give a bump for an event that the ACLU of Virginia is doing in Northern Virginia this afternoon. We're doing a film screening of Injustice, and it's a look inside of Virginia's prison system. So it's a look inside, in particular, what the Virginia Department of Corrections does to families from the perspective of people that are experiencing it, and by some of the experts that are working to try to dismantle this unjust system. So the film is called Injustice, and it's going to be screened tonight at George Mason University, Johnson Center Cinema at 4:15 p.m. You can RSVP to the film by the link that Solveig can drop in the chat box shortly. If you did not RSVP, do not worry. If you show up, you'll still get in. It's totally free. So if you have time to do that, that would be great as well.
Will it be on later or just at 4:15?
So we're doing an initial round of film screenings across the state right now. This was the first screening in the Northern Virginia area. I believe, after some months of doing these film screenings, they'll be available for free online. Although don't quote me on that. I need to talk to our communications team to see what their plan is for the film.
I know, because it'd be very useful if we were able to possibly see it before the election.
Yes. Yeah. So the film, you can see it definitely today at 4:15. And maybe I can talk to my comms team, see if it'll be available for public consumption for free online before the election, but I need to check with them. I can't speak for them.
Thank you.
I'm sending this to Janelle. Janelle, I'm sending this to you. Can you please drop it in?
Yes.
I'm sending it to you right now.
Alrighty, I'll pop that in the chat.
Yeah. Because you are way better at that than me.
I just received an email from somebody from a different group asking this question. And so I'm just going to repeat it since it deals with voting. Hello, I am currently in Spain and couldn't find a rep to vote for me. If we can give our vote to a proxy, please send me info to do so. I'm working the Camino and cannot guarantee service with any time differences. I will send her back a reply. I literally just received that. It popped up. Does anyone want to comment? Because this is somebody who is considered an educator, yet obviously has no idea of what to do.
I'm happy to take that on. When it comes to military and overseas, Virginia does have a couple different ways to accommodate those individuals who are overseas. One, if they fill out an application, so if that individual does have a Virginia driver's license, they can complete the application completely online. And then actually Virginia allows us to email ballots to individuals who are overseas or military out of the area, that kind of stuff. What happens in that situation is they get the ballot emailed to them, complete the ballot, print it out, and then mail it back to us, because you cannot vote by proxy, but you can get that email ballot if you're in one of those categories, military or overseas. So that cuts down on the processing, and you can FedEx it, DHL it, however you can get it back to our office so that it's postmarked by election day.
Yes, it was just interesting that comment came through to me just while we were in the middle of this discussion. Thank you very much, Angela.
Absolutely. Happy to help those military and overseas.
Janelle, did you get that?
I just put it in the chat. It's a big ugly link.
Oh, okay, great. Because I was just feeding it in. Yeah. There it is. Big ugly link. Great. But this is a great movie, I think, about injustice in the prison system. Right, Jamshid? Isn't that what you said?
Yeah. So it interviews a number of people that have been through that system, that are currently in that system, and many of whom have come out of that system as advocates for the reform of it. So it includes a number of coalition members that Deb and I work alongside with the Right to Vote Coalition that are central decision makers and players in that coalition. And this is a great way to start understanding exactly what it is that VDOE does from a humane perspective, or what it does to families, what it does to individuals, instead of just looking at the statistics.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. And that's at 4 o'clock, you said?
It's at 4:15, and it's going to be at 4:15 at the George Mason University Johnson Center Cinema.
Oh, okay, we'd have to go someplace then.
Yeah, it is an in-person event. So if you're feeling up for it, for a short little drive on Saturday, it'd be a great opportunity not to only learn more, but also network and meet other people in your area that are interested in this issue as well.
Yeah. And we might be able to pick up that film later at some point on YouTube or some other way.
Yep, I'll keep you updated on that. Once I check with the comms team, I'll see like what they have a timeline for. I know they're going to try to keep it exclusive now while they're doing the film screenings, just because we want to bring people out to meet and network.
Yeah, that would be great if you would let me and Diane know about that, so we could let members know. People really need to be informed about that.
Yes, and just publicize it widely so that people will see it before the election. Because it could impact some people's voting.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so are there any unanswered questions, any further comments from our participants and or closing comments from our speakers?
If nobody has anything to add, then I would just like to make a shameless plug for a library program that is happening next weekend. It is going to be a beginning birding program at Huntley Meadows Park, which is not too far from the Sherwood Library. I put the link in the chat. You do need to register for the event. We will have binoculars if you don't own a pair that you can borrow from the library, or you can bring your own and just follow along. We'll have a Fairfax County Parks naturalist leading the workshop and pointing out different migratory birds, because this is a good time for the birds migrating to see a lot of different species that we don't normally see. So just wanted to share that with you all and say thank you for attending this program.
Is that, Janelle, on the 26th, did you say?
It's on the 25th. It's on Sunday.
Oh, Sunday. Okay, great. That's through the library?
Yeah, let me make sure this. Yeah, 25th is a Sunday. Yep, it's on this
It
Sunday.
is, because I know that Huntley Meadows has birding programs too that originates from them.
Yeah, that's what inspired this. Yep.
So we can register through the library for the birding program then?
Yep.
Okay, great. And just going back to where we were before, did Deb or Angie, did you want to make any closing remarks?
I just wanted to first of all say thank you for having me, and also echo that recruitment. If you have friends or neighbors, we are always searching for election officers. So those are the individuals actually inside that polling place, making sure we get voters to the correct polling place, making sure we get that correct information out. Everyone has to go through training, so you get some great information and familiarity with the whole election process. So it's a long day, but there is a stipend. And we do encourage anyone to register to be an election officer. Only requirements is that you're a registered voter in Virginia.
Oh, that's great. So, and we go through your office then, the the registrar's office of Alexandria.
Yeah.
Question. Did you say so you have to be a registered voter in Alexandria, because we've got a lot of people here in the Fairfax County part of Alexandria?
So to serve as an election officer, you just have to be a registered voter in Virginia.
Sorry, yeah.
Obviously, like if you wanted to serve in the polling place close to your house, you'd have to be in that locality. But if you're Fairfax County, you can come to Alexandria if you're willing to travel a little bit. Don't tell Fairfax County I said that, because I'm sure they're recruiting their own election officers too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's very important information. And Deb, did you want to say something?
Just briefly, I wanted to thank you also for the opportunity to come and speak with you today, and to remind everyone to have a plan for how you're going to vote, and then follow through on it and vote, and take your friends, take your neighbors, check with your family. I ended up driving my mom. I drove out 2 hours to pick her up last year to take her to the polls because she has mobility issues and wasn't sure she was going to vote. And so, reach out and make sure that everybody is voting.
Oh, that's nice. That's great. Well, thank you to all of you for coming, sharing, and giving us your time today and your expertise. We really enjoyed hearing what you had to say, and thank you to all our participants. And Diane, you want to say a few closing words? Finish it off.
Yes, I wanted to thank you very much, all of you participants. You've really educated us and taught us a lot about voting issues that are here now and are potentially coming up. Your expertise and passion for what's happening is so important, is so invigorating also, because it allows us to get fired up to go out and do what has to be done to make sure that these elections remain fair and equal for everybody and available for everybody. Because this is a battle we have to win. Democracy is a battle we have to fight for. And so thank you all very much. And thank you all who turned on to listen to this. Thank you for coming. Your participation makes these forums possible and make these forums interesting and exciting for everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just be sure to follow our speaker's advice on avoid the fraud messages and join a group.
Avoid fraud, definitely.
Join a group that will fight for you.
Yes, the fraud, I think it was like 37 people in the last election in the whole country or something like that. It was some microscopic number that could not register on any possible list.
Yeah.
2 in Pennsylvania. I think there was 1 in Florida. And maybe a couple, I'm assuming there may have been a couple around the rest of 50 states.
Yeah. And don't forget to look at the VCET information that Nick
Yes.
posted about the, and just look at Google it and just look it up on the internet if you don't have the chat, and find out what you can do to be a poll monitor.
So again, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to all our guest speakers. You were wonderful today.
Thank you.